Welcome to SIM-PAC Live. I'm your host, Jeff Matthews. Today we're going to talk about sheltering from oil shocks. Yesterday my daughter sent me a text asking my thoughts about the latest IEA report. So I immediately downloaded it, gave it a read, and honestly it felt like a trip down memory lane. Yes, I'm old enough to remember the oil shocks of the 70s. Because 50 years on, it's the 1970s playbook all over again. Drive less, don't drive so fast, car share, use public transport, cut back on air travel. In fact, the only thing on the IEA short-term response list that wasn't in the 70s playbook was working from home. For the millennials, that's because we didn't have personal computers, email, or the internet. Now, you've all been following what's going on in the war. You know the situation. But the thing we must prepare for is that no matter what happens, these price rises might be baked in for the medium to long term. The expectation is they run through to around 2027. And we all know how this works. We saw it with COVID. Prices went up and they didn't really come back. They just reset. This brings us to where do we go from here? The oil shocks of the 70s were seismic, and our response was also seismic. Some of the biggest nation-building energy projects in New Zealand and Australia came directly out of the 1970s crisis. In New Zealand, the stated goal was 50% energy self-sufficiency and to reduce reliance on imported oil. That led to the development of the Maui gas field, the expansion of the Marsden Point oil refinery, large-scale hydro projects like Clyde Dam, and the production of synthetic fuel from natural gas. It was a coordinated effort to replace imported oil with domestic energy wherever possible and build a system that could stand on its own feet. Australia took a slightly different path, but the same underlying objective of greater self-reliance. It leaned into oil production from Bass Strait, maintained and expanded a strong refining base, and shifted electricity generation away from oil towards coal and gas. Australia reduced its exposure by producing and processing more of its own fuel. In both countries, the response went well beyond immediate conservation. It was about building domestic capability and reducing dependence on global oil markets. And many of these nation-building infrastructure projects went on to underpin our modern economies, delivering decades of relatively stable, low-cost energy that have been fundamental to our economic growth. But over time, we've allowed the dismantling of the very systems that gave us resilience in liquid fuels. We closed refining capacity, reduced domestic fuel processing, and became increasingly reliant on imported petrol, diesel and jet fuel. Today, New Zealand and Australia sit among the most import-dependent countries in the developed world for transport fuels. The result is a strange and uncomfortable position. We have some of the cleanest and most renewable electricity systems anywhere, and at the same time, we're highly exposed to global oil shocks. Australia today holds roughly 30 to 40 days of fuel cover, and this figure includes fuel that's sitting on ships and is well below the IEA requirement of 90 days and among the lowest levels in the developed world. Around 90% of its transport fuel is imported. Refining capacity has been reduced from 8 refineries down to just 2. And New Zealand on paper looks better, with around 90 to 110 days of cover under the IEA measures. But a significant portion of that is held offshore or exists as contractual access rather than physical fuel in the country. And yes, the old dreaded force majeure may bite us in the end. We have no refinery at all. Marsden Point closed down in 2022, and we now import effectively all of our petrol, diesel and jet fuel. Both countries are highly dependent on global supply chains, and both are exposed when these supply chains are disrupted. Now, I know what you'll be saying. What about all the efforts to decarbonise and move towards renewables, Jeff? And the answer is yes, we've done well in parts of the system. Australia leads the world in household solar adoption, with around 1 in 3 homes now generating their own electricity. And has also seen a huge surge in household batteries as people store that energy locally. New Zealand, in the meantime, has been up there globally for decades with hydroelectricity and has added some wind and even a little bit of solar recently. Typically generating about 70 to 80% of electricity from renewable sources. Both countries are in a strong position to electrify large parts of their economy, but that's only half the system, because even if the lights stay on, it doesn't mean the supermarket shelves stay stocked, and it doesn't mean there's petrol at every pump. So what is the IEA recommending in its long-term action list? When you step back and look at this list, there's nothing surprising in it. This is exactly what anyone working in sustainability and decarbonisation has been talking about for the past decade. In fact, if you walked into any SIM-PAC live event, you would hear these same themes being discussed: electrification, efficiency, renewables, industrial optimisation. A couple of points are not so relevant to us down under. And the one thing I would add is demand-side response, learning how to modulate energy use, particularly in industry. So we're using renewable supply intelligently. It's critical to our competitiveness. So the real question isn't what we should do, it's what's stopping us. And most importantly, do we need government-led nation-building investment on the scale we saw after the 1970s oil shocks? My answer is, if we want to get serious, we do. In both Australia and New Zealand, transport and industry account for around 85 to 90% of all the oil use, and I exclude aviation. Now, I've excluded aviation deliberately because it's complicated to significantly decarbonise at scale. And in this context, at around 5 to 8%, it's not as big a factor as you would think. So let's focus on the two sectors that matter most. Transport first. China, the world's largest vehicle market, has already reached around 50% of electrical vehicle adoption. And in heavy transport, it's even more advanced with a rapidly growing share of trucks using battery swap technology. The challenge gets complicated for heavy transport, however, because you can't replace the rolling stock fast enough. Globally, we just don't build enough replacement vehicles. Heavy vehicles, long life assets. That's why retrofitting existing stock with EV battery swap technology matters. It allows you to convert and electrify existing fleets much faster, keep trucks moving, and treat batteries as shared infrastructure rather than something tied to a single vehicle. But to do that at scale, we don't just need one company like Australia's Janus Electric, we need an entire industry doing conversions. And to build an entire industry, you need policy certainty and incentives. I want to jump to passenger transport just for a minute here, because I'm going to give you an example of incentives that are needed in Australia and New Zealand right across the transport sector. And also to turn the electrification of transport into a nation-building exercise. In Australia and New Zealand, electric vehicles sit around 10% at times of new car sales. Now compare that to China, where it's around 50%. And I can hear people saying, but we're not China, Jeff. Fine, let's look at an OECD country. Norway. Norway is around 90 to 95% of all new car sales being electric. It's almost a full transition. And this didn't happen by accident. Norway did two things. Firstly, strong financial signals. They made electric vehicles cheaper than petrol and diesel cars through tax exemptions, no VAT, and lower registration costs. Second, Norway runs almost entirely on renewable electricity. So why can't we be like Norway? We can do tax exemptions, make electric vehicles cheaper. We have great renewable energy assets. So why are we still sitting at 10 when Norway's number's almost at 100? We also need policy as well. Vehicle to everything, V2X, needs to become an urgent priority in both Australia and New Zealand. It's been trialled, but it needs to be rolled out with urgency. In the future, around 90% of all battery storage will be in EVs. And so you can't build a system where 10% of the batteries top up 90% of the batteries. It doesn't work. So EVs must become part of the energy system, charging from solar during the day, discharging at peak, supporting the grid. And that needs to be enabled at scale, and that's where policy matters. Now, one of the things the IEA talks about is strengthening fuel efficiency standards. In Australia and New Zealand, we're not exactly leading here. New Zealand has some basic smoke testing through warrant of fitness checks, and Australia has just introduced a standard for new vehicles. Now look at California. They took a different approach. They focused on the worst offenders, the 5 to 10% of vehicles producing the highest emissions, and removed them from the system faster. They test for it, and in some cases they'll actually pay you to retire the vehicle early, around $1,500 to $2,000 US. And if we're serious about cleaning up the fleet, that's the kind of approach we should be looking at. And the governments buy back other things to keep us safe. When it comes to industry, both Australia and New Zealand are already funding this transition. In Australia, there are hundreds of millions of dollars going into industrial electrification, energy efficiency, fuel switching, both at federal and state level. Well done. New Zealand is doing the same, although not as much vigor. With industry, the direction is clear. We know what needs to be done. We've already started doing it. The question is speed and reach, how fast we do it and how far that extends across sectors, across regions and through the supply chain. So what does reducing our dependence on oil look like from here to 2050, considering these latest oil shocks? To me, it looks a lot like nation building. Norway getting to virtually 100% new car sales being electric, that's nation building. Decarbonising industry through electrification, that's nation building. Making sure our EVs become part of the energy infrastructure through V2X, that's nation building. Making sure our grids get as close to possible as 100% renewable electricity, that's nation building too. And yes, there are plenty of other things we need to do it well. But if we get these big ones right, we deal with the lion's share of the problem. We reduce our dependence on imported oil, we strengthen energy security, and we make ourselves far more resilient to future shocks. We can only control what we can control. We can't control the Strait of Hormuz. We can't control the President of the United States. But we can control our own destiny, especially when it comes to renewables. Our vulnerability is real, and the conversation could go quite quickly from being about fuel prices to being about fuel shortages. And that leads to how we keep our people fed. Good luck. I think we're going to need it.